Almost 2 years ago, my friend Riley and I decided to mill up a fallen ash tree to make into a table, or maybe three. Here is the story of that first table. To begin this episode of Second Son Woodworks, the third part of the From Tree to Table series, I will be sanding down this slab where I inlaid 7 different bow tie joints. The sanding will prepare the slab for the epoxy pour. I start off with 120 grit sandpaper, move to 220 grit, and then to 320 grit. If you haven't already seen parts 1 and 2 of this series From Tree to Table, make sure to check them out. There is a link above as well as in the description. To prep for this epoxy pour, it is essential to get rid of as much dust as possible. Once the entire slab had been sanded down, I went ahead and moved on to prepping for the epoxy pour. For today's epoxy pour, I will be using the ProMarine tabletop epoxy. It is a self-leveling epoxy. I'll put links in the description below for this product. For the first coat, I will just be doing what's called the seal coat. If you do end up using this product, make sure you read the instructions that they have on the internet thoroughly. This is really essential as the process of mixing the resin and the hardener is very important. Pro tip, don't use a linen drop cloth such as the one that I'm using, as the epoxy will bleed through. Make sure to use some sort of plastic. If you don't have an air compressor, I would highly recommend getting one, as it really enhances the finishing process for tabletops such as this. Like I said before, you want to make sure that you thoroughly read through the instructions for whatever epoxy you decide to use for this. ProMarine supplies epoxy. They actually provide a link to a website that has the full instructions on how to mix the hardener and the resin. Essentially, it's just a 1-to-1 ratio. You mix in a bucket for 3 minutes, then you pour into a separate bucket, mix for another 3 minutes, and then you can pour directly onto the surface. And it is self-leveling. You don't want to mix more than 10 minutes, and you want to make sure that the temperature is correct in your shop. Although this video looks like I am mixing really quickly as the video itself is sped up, it's important not to mix too quick, as you'll introduce too many air bubbles into the epoxy. Just have more of a deliberate mix. Make sure to scrape the sides and the bottom, and then you should be good. Once the mixing process was complete, it was time to move on to the first coat of the epoxy, which is called the seal coat. And this essentially seals the slab and especially all of the different cracks and holes that are within the slab, so that when you do the flood coat, there is not as many bubbles. I use a foam brush to spread the epoxy across the slab. If you decide to use a foam brush such as this, make sure that you do really deliberate brush strokes. It's not like painting, it's more of just spreading this liquid, and you can let it drip over the sides, break the surface tension with your brush so that it equalizes, and then once it kind of has a couple minutes to settle, you can use a torch to get out the bubbles. This is one of my favorite steps in doing a table like this, so make sure you enjoy it. When you do the seal coat, you'll notice that some parts of the wood will suck up more epoxy than other parts of the wood. So it's okay to pour some more of the epoxy over these sections and then spread it out with the foam brush. Then, like I said before, I use a propane torch to heat up the epoxy and pop the bubbles that accumulate. You want to hold the torch gun about 3 to 5 inches above the tabletop and then just move it around and it will pop the majority of the bubbles. I do this several times before I leave the slab to dry. If you don't have a torch gun, you can use a heat gun or an air compressor, but I think the torch works the best. You'll notice here that I'm rubbing the bottom edge of the slab where the drips of the epoxy have accumulated to try to reduce these drips as much as possible. But later on in the video, I end up flipping the slab over to sand these drips out, which is totally fine. Pro tip number 2, don't get too close to the epoxy with the torch or else it will catch on fire. You want to make sure to let the seal coat just dry for about 3 to 4 hours before doing what is called the flood coat. If you let the epoxy dry for longer than 3 to 4 hours, then you will need to scuff up the epoxy, the top of epoxy, with some sandpaper so that the flood coat will adhere. So after going down to the beach, hopping in the ocean, and doing some snorkeling with some friends, I came back to the shop and prepped for the flood coat. Like I stressed earlier on in the video, it is essential that you thoroughly read through the instructions that are provided with whatever epoxy product you decide to use. For this ProMarine Supplies tabletop epoxy, which is a 1-to-1 hardener and resin epoxy, they provide a link to instructions that are on the internet that are really detailed and have lots of useful tips for this process. I'll put a link in the description below. I'll also note that this type of epoxy is different than the river table epoxy that you probably have seen all over the internet, which is for much thicker pours. This is just for the top, so make sure that you don't use this type of epoxy for that type of project. For those of you who are still watching, I want to thank you for tuning into an episode of Second Son Woodworks. If you haven't hit the subscribe button below, you should do it now. It is a great way to help out my channel. Hit the little bell icon next to it so you stay notified when I release new project videos. And if you want to do some shopping through my affiliate links for the products that I use in this video, you should hit those links below, as I get a small portion of the sales. It's a great way to help out my channel. If you have any questions or comments, you should leave them below and let me know what you think about this video. Since the flood coat will be the last coat of epoxy on this tabletop, I made sure to apply enough over the sections that had sucked up the seal coat epoxy, and then I break the surface tension with this brush so that it self-levels over top of the entire slab. When you're doing the flood coat and using a foam brush such as this to spread the epoxy over top of the slab, it's tempting to get distracted by all of the bubbles that accumulate. But don't worry, they will kind of settle, and then later on you will come back, or you can come back with a torch gun to get rid of the bubbles. I would recommend using a foam brush like the one that I am using, as it really helps you be able to spread the epoxy into the areas where it might not flow naturally, such as within these cracks where I have the bow tie joints. It's a really helpful tool to use. The nice thing about using a torch gun to heat up the top and get rid of the bubbles is that it actually also helps the epoxy level. You'll notice that I'm not wearing a mask during this process, as this epoxy is actually a non-toxic epoxy, so it doesn't give off too intense of fumes. But you want to be careful if you are using some different types of epoxies. They will be giving off an extreme fume that isn't really good for you, so make sure you wear a mask if that is the case. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, it's a good idea to hit the surface of the epoxy pour with the torch several times before you leave it to fully dry. And what I mean by that is hit it with the torch and then let it sit for several minutes and let some more of those air bubbles come up, and then hit it again. Once the epoxy had fully cured, I flipped the slab over and used a low grit sandpaper to sand off the drips that had accumulated on the underside of the slab. You could also use a razor blade to cut these drips off, but I decided to just use the sandpaper. One day I would like to get one of those fancy branding irons that I can do a logo on the bottom of the table, but a Sharpie will do for now. And now for the last step, I needed to prep the bottom to be finished. Get yourself a pack of those microfiber towels. Instead of using epoxy in the bottom side of the table, I decided to use an oil-based polyurethane. I did 2 coats with a sanding in between. Alright folks, that concludes part 3 of the series From Tree to Table, the epoxy pour. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't watched the first 2 parts of this series, make sure to check them out. If you haven't hit the subscribe button, please do it now. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. And stay tuned for the 4th part of this series where I will be building the metal base. Alright folks, get in the shop, build something cool. Take care.